This week in the scriptures, we go with Jesus to Gentile territory, Syria area, where the Greek Phoenicians were in charge. Jesus is kind of on holiday this time around and trying to get away from all the attention that he gets in Galilee. This story actually is one of my favorites, and the reason it's my favorite is because it butts up against Jesus' humanity. Far too often in the church, we try to focus on the Christ and not the Jesus. So we spend all of this time talking about the divinity and God's messenger and the Trinity and all that kind of stuff that the early church spent centuries working out, but we forget about Jesus as the human person, which is the whole point of incarnation to begin with, that Jesus became like us. And by like us, it means with the foibles and mistakes that we make too. And this week we actually encounter that in the story with the Syrophoenician woman. Jesus screws up. Jesus makes a mistake. Jesus kind of says something and he has to dial it back. So he's sitting in this house with his friends, maybe a few other people that he's visiting with. And this woman comes in and bows down and says, Lord, which just another word of sir. It's not any indication that she recognizes that this is God incarnate, just that he's a very powerful healing person, a very powerful presence, and asks for help curing her daughter, getting rid of demons. Now, we've talked about this in the past. Getting rid of demons, we're not really sure what that means. It can be as simple as getting rid of a cold. It can be mental illness. It can be all sorts of things. But at the time of Jesus, there was a definite hierarchy. And the hierarchy was demons were higher than humans and gods were higher than demons. So the only one who could get rid of demons is someone who is in the God realm. So she recognized that at least. There was something very connected between Jesus and a higher power. So she asks him for his help. And Jesus missteps. And he says, I didn't come for you. I came for the children of Israel. She doesn't leave. She's just as persistent as some of the other women we've encountered. And she says, even the puppies get the crumbs that the children drop from the table. And Jesus has to stop and say, yeah, you know what? You're right, I'm wrong. And then he says his classic, your faith has made your daughter well. Go on. In this encounter, not only is Jesus facing his humanity, but Jesus is facing something else that I think a lot of us are called into. It's really easy when we are surrounded by church people or the good people or whomever our crowd is, to dismiss the other person, the beggar, the one who comes asking for help. Dismiss them as an individual. But her argument isn't an individual. She doesn't say, I am good, I deserve it. She doesn't say, think of my child. She says collectively, culturally, even those of us who are not part of the house of Israel still get to have the crumbs from what those children have. We sometimes look at issues and we try to individualize them. And I think we're in a place right now where we've overdone that. We've overplayed that. We forget about community and how significant that is. One of the things I'm always telling you is that you have to keep tension between when the Gospels were written, for the audience that heard them, and the characters inside the story itself, and you got to hold those in tension. But there's another tension to be held as well, and that is our modern day, our modern contribution to the story. Because one of the things about living scripture is not that God dictated it, but that it is such a profound series of stories about real life, that real life continues to play out over the centuries. And we're never done with these stories. There's always new ways to look at them in with the basis of, in the context of where we are in our up-to-date modern existences. And I think in the last couple of weeks, anybody who's been following the news, especially here in North America, has got to notice the pattern of how women are being shunted aside. We've got the horrible things going on in Afghanistan, but now we've also got the real in our face reality of what women in Texas are going to be dealing with. Florida says they're going to be coming up. Here in Canada, we have challenges in New Brunswick for women's health care, primarily around reproductive health care. And this is we can look at the scripture of the Syrophoenician woman and look at some of these wider issues that are involving women. So often the discussion, particularly in safety or in abortion or in reproductive rights or in rape or in any of these situations where women are essentially the underdogs, the victims in most cases, we tend as a society to individualize them. Well, if they'd only been at the airport in time, we would have gotten them out. If they'd only left earlier, we would have gotten them out. If someone had only kind of paid attention earlier, it would have been okay. If a woman didn't get pregnant when she didn't want to be, then it would be fine. If women just stopped sleeping around, it would be okay. The problem with these arguments is that they deny the fact that the women are struggling not because of who they are individually, but by who they are collectively, as a gender, as a culture. Jesus did not hear an argument from a woman. He heard an argument from a culture saying, we matter too. And that's the argument that we can listen to. That's one of the ways we can hear the Syrophoenician woman in the story of us today. When crises happen, when victims happen, when the underdog happens, it's really easy for those of us who are comfortable and in privilege just to dismiss us. In fact, those who want to silence the vulnerable, they depend on those of us with privilege to just dismiss it as a one-off. I remember I was in Nicaragua 30 odd years ago, and I was in a cafe. This homeless woman came up to me and she wanted some money to eat. I was finished what I was eating and there was still plenty on the plate. So I just gave it to her and fed her. That's probably the only meal she had that day. And when I went back to join my group got mad at me. And they said, well, you shouldn't have fed her because the issue is systemic, removing from the issue of her personally to another issue. So that's how the privileged do things. We either make things individualized about the person, or we like to get lofty and talk about, well, it's a whole system of relationships and we cannot, or we do not have the power to make a difference. Then we need to turn back to the story of the Syrophoenician woman, because she represented a culture, but she was also a person. Jesus represented a culture, but he was also a person. And even though the culture that these two people engaged in, that said males were more important than females, that said Hebrew culture protected itself, Greek culture had kind of run its course because the Romans had now taken over, that said someone in poverty should not approach someone with more benefits and more wealth, which you'd have to have if you were on vacation, that kind of interaction shouldn't matter. And an additional one in that day and age, that someone was approached for a child who was not considered with the same sense of importance that we have children today. So everything was in a power dynamic where the woman should have been told, no, sent away, you don't matter. And that's what Jesus did, until she reminded him that there's a bigger picture. There's a bigger gift from God. And even though the gift of God of grace might seem originally for the group that is easy to access it, who has the privilege of being part of the temple culture or being in the synagogues or being in our churches or having obvious benefits of wealth and well-fed and whatever else that we take for granted, that grace is not something for us to control and hold. It's something that we also have to give on. And Jesus was reminded of that by this nameless woman, that it's something that we give. God gives to us and we pass it along. Jesus' humanity received God's grace and passed it along to this woman. We in our modern day world have to take the grace of God and pass it along. So when we're looking at people who are hungry, the grace of God coming through us means that we feed them. Even if we can't feed everybody, we feed who we can. And then we work to change the system. Even if we can't protect every woman, we protect who we can, and then work to change the system. We can't protect every child, but we can protect the ones closest to us, and then we work to change the system. See, in Jesus' encounter with the Syrophoenician woman, it wasn't a one-off. It wasn't his one encounter with Gentile culture and they went back to spend all of the rest of his ministry with the Hebrews. Because we see in the scripture that he left the Syrophoenician woman's area, and he continued on through Tyre, and he went to Damascus, to the Decapolis, which means 10 cities, and he healed someone else. He healed a blind man who couldn't speak. In that instance, rather than being around a group of people, he took him off to the side, and Jesus did whatever he could to allow this person to see and speak and hear again. And then, of course, it's Mark. So we get the admission, don't tell anybody, which, of course, the minute you say don't tell someone, of course you're going to tell someone. That's the way that works. So we have the sharing of the story. But Jesus learned from that encounter with the Syrophoenician woman that helping the Gentiles was also part of God's message. Helping the world is part of God's message and the grace that we share. Helping the world today, our modern world, our hurricane victims and our tornado victims and our earthquake victims, that's part of God's grace. That those of us who have not suffered that now can share our bounty with someone else. When we see a woman having her basic rights denied, it is up to us to step in and do what we can. It might only be writing a letter. It might be paying for any legal fees. It might be escorting. It might be getting them out of the situation. But we do what we can because the grace of God was given to us to share with others in need. That's ultimately the takeaway from today. We have the benefit, just like Jesus, to learn when we misstep. We don't have to stay in our mistakes. We can be reminded, and those who are marginalized can be very quick to point out what we're missing, what's not obvious to us. But we can step back and we can change and we can realize the goof we had made and then work to make it better. Jesus is just not an example of how to be glorious. Jesus is also an example of how to be human. Make a mistake, not understand an issue, dismiss something. That's all very human in a response. But when someone calls you on it, realize when you've made a misstep, back it up. Because the grace of God is not just for a select group of people. It is for everyone, and no one has the right to decide who is worthy of grace and freedom and self-determination. Those are gifts as human beings we get to claim. No one gets to tell us what we cannot do. And Jesus reminded us that when he healed the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. Give God's grace through us. That is the Christian thing to do. Following Jesus' footsteps. Sometimes we make mistakes, and that's okay.